My client for this project is in Germany, and he has asked me to make a chessboard and a box with drawers to hold his chess pieces. The squares are going to be made from bird's eye maple and Bolivian rosewood, so I'll cut those pieces to length. I found this one piece of bird's eye maple that is highly figured. A lot of people wouldn't want such a narrow piece of wood, but it's perfect for making chess squares. I'll run these through the jointer to get one face and one edge flat and squared up. This piece of maple has a stripe running through the middle, but I'll use that side to glue to the plywood substrate so it'll never be seen. And then I can run all the pieces through the planer. Now I'll cut them a little oversized to remove most of the excess. These are about 23 millimeters thick, or just a little less than an inch, so I'll set the fence on my bandsaw to be just a little more than 10 millimeters to allow for the thickness of the blade. Then I'll resaw each piece down the middle and run them through the drum sander so that everything is the same thickness. I'll use this scrap piece of plywood to set up the table saw to cut a 60 millimeter width, which is very close to 2 3/8 of an inch. It's just slightly under, but with a bit of glue between the squares, it will work out to be pretty close to 60 millimeters. I'll cut all the pieces to width, and then they'll be ready for the first glue up. I'm going to glue up the pieces for the top and bottom of the board, so I'll glue everything at the same time and just stack them on top of each other, separated by a piece of parchment paper to prevent them from sticking together. I'll let that cure overnight and I can start working on the frame. I have this 10-foot long piece of walnut that I will cut to rough width. I'll cut them into equal lengths and head over to the jointer. I ran them through the planer as well, but somehow I didn't record that. At the table saw, I'll cut them to the 3-inch width, and then I'll switch to a dado blade so that I can cut a groove along the outside edge of each frame piece for the edge banding. I'll cut the groove large enough, but a little bit narrower than the maple edge banding, and then I will use the drum sander on the edge banding to get it to fit perfectly. I'll let the glue dry while I sand the first glue up of the chessboard squares. With my crosscut sled, I will cut one end to be straight and square with the adjoining side, and then I will cut 60mm strips. I'm cutting 16 of these to have enough for the top and the bottom of the chessboard. Next, I'll cut a square piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I will glue the squares onto. This plywood square is 1 inch larger than the playing field will be, and that's so that I can attach the frame onto the plywood using a tongue and groove fitting. Now I'll quickly glue up the first side. While the glue is drying, I can trim off the excess edge banding. Now I'll glue up the other side of the chessboard. I'll use the drum sander to remove the excess glue and to make sure it's flat. It's almost impossible to align the squares on the top and the bottom of the board so that the frame would fit perfectly. So I'm trimming off a very small amount along the edges of the playing field on both sides so that the frame will fit snugly along the top and bottom. Now I will cut a groove along the inside edge of the frame pieces to fit over the plywood tongue. I'll set the blade height to the thickness of this 1/8 inch brass bar, and then cut a rabbet along the inside edge of the frame for the brass to fit into. And now I'll attach the brass using Starbond CA glue. I spray the brass with accelerant so that it bonds quickly. I let that sit for about an hour, and then I use the table saw to remove the excess brass. This causes a lot of metal particles to get embedded in my clothes and skin, so it's important to wear a face shield when doing this. Then I'll use the drum sander to sand the brass flush with the walnut, being sure to take only light passes so that the brass doesn't get too hot. Next, I'll cut the mitered corners of the frame pieces. I always cut them just a little bit long and then sneak up on the fit to make sure everything fits tightly against the playing field. Before gluing on the frame, I'll carve a quotation on this frame piece that I will fill with epoxy. It would have been nice to inlay wood for the quotation, but the quotation is so long that the letters are pretty small, so it would have been difficult to carve the inlay without breakage. Now I'll mix up some Total Boat epoxy and tint it with black dye. The quotation is pretty close to the ends, so I'll use some tape to make a dam to prevent the epoxy from spilling onto the end and messing up the miter. Then I'll use a heat gun to help release air bubbles and to help ensure that the epoxy goes all the way to the bottom. The next day, I ran that piece through the drum sander to remove the excess epoxy. Now, on the other side of the chessboard, I will carve algebraic notation into each of the frame pieces. On this last side, the client asked me to add my signature and the date. This is the date that I started the project in day, month, year format, so February 1st, 2025. Now with a piece of ash, I will carve the male notation that I will inlay into the frame. I'll fill my signature and date with black epoxy, and then I will glue in the notation. I'll clamp everything in place to make sure the inlay is properly seated to get a tight fit, and then let it cure overnight. Now I can remove the excess inlay, then run the pieces through the drum sander, and then I can glue the frame onto the chessboard. Now I'll sand off the excess glue and get the playing field and frame flush with each other. And then there's one more engraving to do to add the client's initials on the side that does not have the algebraic notation. I will apply gold leaf on the initials, so I will start by applying a sealer. I'll let that dry for about an hour, and then I can apply the sizing, which is the adhesive. I try to brush out any excess so there are no puddles, and then I'll let that dry for about 30 minutes. Now I'll apply the gold leaf using a brush. With the chessboard more or less done, now I can work on the box for the chess pieces. The box will be made out of black walnut, and the drawers will be made out of a combination of walnut and ash. These boards need to be flattened for sure. I'll straighten the edge first and then trim off some excess on the table saw to minimize the amount of material that I need to remove when jointing the face. This thicker piece of walnut will be used for the box. I'll resaw it down the middle and then plane both pieces to be roughly a ½ inch thick. Now I'll resaw the drawer sides to split them down the middle, and then I'll run them through the drum sander to get them to the same thickness. I'm going to use box joints, and I want 8 squares just like on a chessboard. So to determine the thickness, I'll divide the height of the drawer by 8, and this worked out to be about 0.4 inches thick. Now I'll cut the sides of the box to the correct width, which will be the height of the box. These narrower pieces will be used as rails to connect the box sides together. I'll cut these to be approximately a ½ inch, and then I will finish them up on the drum sander. I'll cut these to length, and that will be the width of the drawers. Now I'll cut grooves into the box sides and rails that the plywood top and bottom will fit into. I'll cut these to be just a little more than 1/4 of an inch. I can't go all the way through because the groove would be exposed, so I'm starting a few millimeters away from the end. For the rails, I can go all the way through because they're going to butt into the box sides. Now I'll cut the walnut plywood and then glue everything together. This plywood is a little warped because it's been sitting in my garage for quite a while. Now I'll cut the pieces for the drawers. And then I'll use my Engraving iBox jig to cut the box joints. I'll make 4 cuts in each piece to end up with 8 squares in each corner. I'll use the router again with a 1/4 inch plywood bit to cut a groove for the plywood bottom. Now I'll cut the plywood bottoms and then glue up the drawers. And now I'll make some thin strips out of walnut to be the drawer runners and kickers. I'll glue the runners in place and then insert a drawer to apply a bit of pressure. Next, I'll flip the box over, glue in the kickers, and then insert the drawer one more time. Now I'll use these leftover pieces of ash and cut them into strips so that I can make the compartments that will go in each drawer to hold the chess pieces. The dimensions that I'm cutting here on the table saw is the height of the compartments, and then I will take these over to the bandsaw to cut them into thin strips that are 1/8 of an inch thick. It would be nice to make them a little thicker, but 1/8 of an inch makes it easy to cut them later because that's the thickness of my table saw blade. I'm cutting them a little thicker than that, and then I will use the drum sander to bring them down to exactly 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to make this jig attached to my miter gauge. The first cut I'm making is to just hold a 1/8 inch thick piece of wood. The bases of the chess pieces have different diameters. The pawns have the smallest diameter. The rooks, knights, and bishops all have the same diameter that is a little larger than the pawns, and then the queen and king each have slightly larger diameters. I'll set this first one up to be 1 5/8 inches wide, and then I made another one that's 1 7/8 of an inch wide. Then I'll move over and set up a couple more for the different widths. And now I can start making the cuts. I make the first cut at the end by just eyeballing it. And then I'll move that piece over to the wooden piece and then make the cuts for the rook, knight, and bishop. With this setup, it makes it easy and quick to make repeatable cuts. Now I'll cut the short pieces that give me enough room to accommodate the tallest piece, the king, and I'll also cut shorter ones for the row of pawns. And then I'll glue everything together. Then I trim off any excess length. And now I'm taking some leftover pieces of ebony to make 2 drawer pulls. With one drawer positioned to be fully closed, I'll reach in from the other side and place 2 stop blocks. And then I'll do the same from the other side with the other drawer in place. And now I'll spray on a few coats of pre-catalyzed lacquer. I'll just use lacquer out of a spray can for these little compartments because there's less force coming out of it compared with a spray gun. While the finish is drying, I'm going to use my laser to put the client's initials on a set of checkers. This was a set of checkers that I had lying around that I had made a couple of years earlier. I made them on my CNC and there's nothing special about them, but adding his initials does make them special. These checkers are made from ash and padauk. Now I'll place some felt in the bottom of each drawer and glue in the compartments for all the pieces. I'm not using too much glue, so they'd be pretty easy to remove if the client ever wants to change the felt. So I gotta ask, would you make it?